everybody, welcome back to Painting Big. This is Anne, and this month we are going to talk about palettes. I decided to go and do some videos that are apart from technique that are still really useful information if you're starting out. When you are starting out as a painter, a lot of people will point you toward a particular palette that they use and particular supplies that they use. There's obviously more than one choice, so I thought I would do a quick rundown on what's good about well palettes versus wet palettes. All right, let's get to it. All right, here we are. Disclaimer, I am a well palette user. I've used both. I believe that it's a very good idea for every painter to try out both and to give each a chance because they're really good at different things, in my opinion. Like where they shine is in two different places. So without further ado, let us get to the wet palette, which is these days what most people are pointed toward in painting, in my experience. So for the wet palette, why do people like it? Why are a lot of new painters pointed toward this palette? Well, it's because obviously with acrylics, the biggest problem is that they dry, right? And this keeps them wet. So what you've got in a wet palette is you've got a case of some sort, usually with a lid. You've got a reservoir where you can fill it with water. You've got a sponge, which I've pre-wetted my sponge here just to have it lie flat, otherwise it tends to be crinkly. And you've got paper of some sort. And it's worth noting that different wet palette brands will come with their own paper, and some will just utilize an equivalent to Baker's parchment paper. This is just parchment. I just grab Baker's parchment paper and use it on mine. I've also used the Masterson wet palette and their paper. I actually don't mind, but a lot of people don't like it. So you're going to come across, again, these differing opinions of what people like. You know, everybody's gonna like something different. Now you see this? See what my paper is doing without me even touching it? That's the paper. That's the fluid essentially causing the paper to contract. It's magic. It's magic, right? My paper is like, don't put me in the wet palette, please. I'm crawling out. That is hilarious. I did not plan that, by the way. So one tip that I'm going to give you, and you can see it happening again, is whatever paper you use, you need to pre-wet. And sometimes it, like with the Masterson wet palette paper, it will tell you very, very much so to soak your paper beforehand because that's a much heavier paper. This parchment, very, very thin, obviously. And so for this, I'll pour a little bit of water in here. I normally have a much wetter palette, but you just pretty much need to get both sides of the paper wet. And once you do, you will see that it will stop trying to crawl out of your palette and it will lay like more or less flat. Another thing to mention is that different wet palettes come with different colors of sponge. I don't remember which brand this is, and for some reason this wet palette does not have a brand on it. But I really like this one for the white sponge. Some of them have like yellow sponges or other colors. Gray is pretty decent because it's a neutral, but I like the white. The downside of the white is that obviously if you get any like staining paint in your wet palette, I think I've got a stain over here somewhere. Oh yeah, there's a blue one. So blues and greens tend to stain a little bit, and you can see I've got a little bit of a splotch there from that. But otherwise, yeah, you've got your nice paper, you've got your palette. Normally, I would keep quite a bit of water in here. I'm not today because obviously if I pick this up and tilt it around, I don't want it to splash all over my desk. But yeah, normally people will work, again, this is a preference thing. Some people will work very dry with their wet palette and some people will work very wet with it. And the amount of water you put in and the type of paper that you use determines how much water is going to wick up into your paint on the surface. So that's absolutely going to happen. This is a permeable membrane. That's why you're using it, is that you want the dampness to come up underneath and help keep your acrylic paint from drying. So you do need a certain amount of water. You can actually see right now, see the wrinkling? My paper is actually drying because I don't have enough water in my wet palette. So, well, let's just go. Let's go for dangerous land, right? Let's just put more water in there and hope I don't splash it all over everything. So I'm going to re-wet my paper again. It's damp, so it shouldn't need much. If you find that there are big beads of water on top of your wet palette, just take like a Kleenex or a paper towel or something. Just lightly go over the surface. That'll remove all the big drops. So there we go. So now I've got, you can see... Can you see the amount of water kind of splooshing here? Yeah, you can see I've got some water in there, right? So now my palette should be actually fine. As long as I've got enough to keep my sponge very wet, I should be able to just use it like this. I know people who fill it so full that their paper is essentially floating on top of their water. And it's going to give you different effects with different types of paper, right? So okay, why are some other reasons people like the wet palette so much. It is easy to travel with. It's once you dry out the sponge like a day in advance, and you know, it'll just close, put a bunch of extra paper in there, and it's very easy. If you walk away from it at a convention, you can just close it up, and the lid's going to keep it nice and wet, so your paint will stay wet while you walk away and go shopping or talk with your friends or play a game or three. And then when you come back, your paint's still good, right? So that's why people really love it for travel and conventions, and just in general, anywhere they're going to get distracted. If you've got little kids or a lot of pets and they're very distracting, this is nice because you can close it, walk away, and walk back. And probably the last reason people really like these is ease of cleaning. Once you've got your paper full of all paint, all you have to do really is to pitch that paper and just grab a new little piece, which if you're using baking parchment is super inexpensive. So it's very easy. And again, at conventions, that's great, right? Because you might not be able to find a sink to clean out your palette in. And so it can get kind of dirty if you're using a well palette, if you're just wiping out the wells, for example. So that's all the reasons why people like these. So what are these really good at? In my opinion, they're very much better with thicker paint. And that's because, again, the water is going to start wicking up through your paper. So if you start with thicker paint, it's going to, it's going to stay at a decent consistency for you for longer. So when you try to thin paint on this surface, you're going to actually have some issues because it's going to go in reverse. The extra water you put up on top is going to go down. So definitely better for thicker paint applications. The other thing is when you thin a lot of paint on top of the palette, if you get too thin, it just capillaries all over the place, right? Which is a mess. So definitely better for thicker paint. A lot of people would say it's a more artistic option. It forces you to kind of mix creatively and intuitively. It will get you more comfortable with mixing. Even if you pre-mix your colors on top of the palette, inevitably you're going to find yourself just putting down drops of paint and mixing as you go. So it encourages that sort of thing, and it can develop a good talent for mixing and a good, just a comfort level for mixing. And that's definitely a good thing when you're dealing with painting miniatures, in my opinion. And what's its downsides? All right, so downsides. The sponge can mold. You can see some little kind of circles and bits here, these little dark bits. Those are not paint stains. Those are actually me leaving the water in here too long. This happens to my fiance all the time. He is notorious for forgetting his wet palette, and the sponge will absolutely mold. And you can mitigate this. I just put a drop of dish soap underneath my sponge. Some people put a copper penny underneath their sponge. I've heard all sorts of tricks to essentially just create an environment that's not as friendly to fungus. That'll help you. Nonetheless, you're going to want to clean this sucker out and let it dry out when you're really not using it regularly. You don't want to leave it wet all the time sitting in your palette. It will grow stuff. You will have a petri dish instead of a wet palette. Second, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it's very hard to work with really thin paint consistencies on a wet palette. It's not going to hold the paint at the consistency you need it. It's going to wick water back and forth. So it's not going to be really good for really dialing in a paint consistency. As you get good with them, you can certainly do an end run around this. You will get a feel for it, but it will take you a while. So it's not quite, in my opinion, if you're working on understanding paint consistency and technique, it's not the easiest format to do that in. Otherwise, though, the wet palette is a great tool that's easy to clean and it's travel friendly, and I can see why people really like it, especially when, as I said, you're starting out with these acrylic paints that dry really fast. And so this can seem like a magic thing for you, especially if you're in an arid climate. So, all right, let's talk about, I've given you your time, wet palette. Now, all right, this is my well palette, folks. I get it at Cheap Joe's Art Supplies here in the USA. It is a 28 well porcelain palette. This is the one I recommend for miniature painting. It is generally priced at around or under $10. So it is really, it's $10, but it's not any more expensive than a wet palette, and probably in many cases is cheaper. So porcelain, why is that important? Let's invert here and talk about the downsides first, and then we'll talk about the good things. The downsides to your well palette. You have to keep wetting your paint to keep it wet. So you're going to have to keep adding water as you paint in order, because they are going to evaporate. The second downside is cleaning. Obviously, you need to clean this palette. You can't just throw away a surface layer of paper. You actually have to take it to a sink and scrub it out. And probably I do need to mention finally breakable, just because I use the porcelain one. So if you drop this onto a hard concrete floor or stone, it will absolutely tend to break. It won't shatter into a million zillion pieces. It'll just break into chunks. So you do have to actually be careful with it. That said, it is still relatively travel friendly. I've put them in suitcases. I usually just sandwich them between clothes and they come through fine when I bring my pallets to a con. So your mileage may vary. Just be careful with it. Okay, what are they brilliant for? Why would I use this thing that I need to clean and I need to add water to and all of that? Why? And also, why the 28 well one instead of those little round flower shaped ones with 6 or 8 wells that you can find at your average Hobby Lobby? What these are brilliant for is learning paint consistency. If you are just starting out and you don't know, you're like, oh my God, I don't know how much I need to thin my paint for this or that or the other thing. I just have no concept of what it should look like or feel like or look like on the model. I don't know. I'm new. This is a great tool for learning that. And the reason is that you can put a specific, especially if you're using a dropper bottle paint line, which most of them are these days. But even if you're using a paint pot, it's not like you still can't ladle it out, in a fairly standard manner. So I can control the amount of paint to water that I can build in each of these. I can control it down to the drop. I can essentially build formulas. I can learn what 4:1 looks like in X like. I can learn what 2:1 looks like in X like. How about 1:1? How about 1:2? I can utilize this in order to really tightly control my paint consistency. And that lets me sit and use a 2:1 mix for a while until I start to get an intuitive feel for how 2:1 acts. Then maybe I want to play with 1:1. What do I have to do now? How do I have to switch things up? How does it affect the paint to be thin that much? How does it feel to work with? How much do I have to unload my brush? All this lets you, if you're like me, and I'm a control freak, I love data, I love experimentation, I love that kind of breakdown. So for me, that was the game changer, is when I started really using this tool to intuitively understand, okay, now I don't even really need to mix in 4:1s and 2:1s. I still do out of habit, but I know what a 2:1 mix looks like, and I can just work with a paint. I can just mix it to sight, really, to touch and feel. Now, the brilliant thing about this is that once you have used this palette in this manner, you can go back to your wet palette and utilize that gut understanding of paint consistency. You know how it should look. You know how it should go and load onto your brush and how it should look on the model. So I find it much easier to work with the wet palette since I became a lot more familiar with paint consistency in the well palette. And that's why I always say you should try both. Obviously, the other thing this palette is really good for is working with thin paint, because you can mix a 1:2 paint to water ratio and it's going to be fine. It's going to sit in its well. It's not going to slurp through your sponge or capillary across your entire work surface. It's really, really good for washes and glazes and any thinned consistencies. I use it for layering all the time, for layering highlights. We'll talk about that technique coming up on this series of videos. And the other thing about this is it will keep that paint at the perfect consistency for a while. Although, as I mentioned, you do need to re-wet your paint. The key here is in using enough volume in each of these little wells. And that is why the 28 well palette. As you can see, one of my little fingers pretty much fits in one of these little wells. They're very small. If you put 4 or 6 drops of paints in here with a couple of drops of water, your paint's actually going to stay wet and well. Even if you're in a super arid climate, it's still going to stay at the right consistency for at least 20 or 30 minutes. And honestly, if you're in a super arid climate, just add a little bit more paint and water and it'll stay better for longer. I used to paint at Reaper Paint Club, which was 4 hours indoors in air conditioning, so fairly low humidity. And I could keep my paint going through that entire 4 hours just by taking a break every hour, hour and a half, just adding a little bit more water and keep it on going. So it's totally doable to work for a while with this well palette. Okay, so it does do that. It does give you more control as you can mix colors in specific ratios, and it tends to lend to that, right? Because it's making you segment different colors into different holes. You can still do spot mixes. I do it all the time. I just pick a little paint out of here and a little paint out of here, and I just mix them up here just a little bit if I just need a touch of a highlight. it's fine. So it does give you that. It does give you more control. It does give you the ability to mix in more precise ratios and thus to duplicate formulas maybe just a little bit easier. Obviously, if you've got a good eye for color, then that doesn't matter. And on the wet palette, you're going to be fine. You can do everything on each type of palette. You can produce great miniatures on both types of palettes. It's all just what you gravitate toward. And the palette and the techniques that you gravitate toward because of the palette you use, or maybe you choose your palette because of the techniques you love, those are just going to become a part of your painting journey and your eventual painting style, which you'll develop one way or another. Your models will have a particular look to them eventually, because you're just going to gravitate towards certain techniques that you love and certain tools that you love, be it a particular brush, a particular palette, particular range of colors, all those things. So bottom line is, use both, know what both are good for, and just explore, have fun, play. That's what the hobby is good for. Just one last thing about cleaning with these guys. As you can see, my palette is really clean. And I mean, I've been using this sucker for years. So how? Why? This is another reason for the porcelain. If you buy a plastic or metal one of these, you're going to have some issues cleaning it. Essentially, it may clean up fine for the first couple times, but every time you clean it, you're going to be abrading the surface a little bit, probably, right? You're going to have to scratch at it to get the dried paint off. You're going to have to, scrub it a little bit. And every time you do that with metal and plastic, acrylic paint just gets more of a surface to cling to. So essentially, no matter what you do with those palettes, you are going to get paint onto them, and it is going to just get on there and not let go. Whereas the porcelain is smooth. It's glass, right? It's glass-like with this. If you look at it, see how shiny it is? So with this, all I have to do is put it in the sink with a little bit of hot water and maybe a spritz of light cleanser and leave it for a few minutes and then come back to it, and the paint usually comes right up. I use a green scrubby pad if I have to, but otherwise, not a big deal. Even if I've had paint just dried on there, then you might have to let it soak for 10 minutes if you've let your paint totally dry in there. But otherwise, it comes up just fine. I'm going to close on showing you guys a couple miniatures. So this model was painted with a wet palette. We painted it on Reaper Pro Tips, and I painted it entirely with a wet palette. It's hard maybe to tell, except that maybe you can see, for one thing, there aren't a lot of really bright light colors on it. And that is because as you get lighter in color, it becomes harder. You need more water added to get good blends. And so with this, I stayed more in a mid-range. And when I did highlight it up, I used a lot of yellow instead of going up with white. The only places I used the white is up here on the gemstones, where you can see that I was able to use it to kind of edge highlight some of these up here, and I was painting solid surfaces. But you can see totally that I don't have blends here. See how rocky that kind of is. It doesn't have a perfect blend on it. This is a lot of just little touches for highlights rather than blending. And that's something that the wet palette is definitely I find it hard to do smooth blends with really light colors on the wet palette because keeping my paint at the right consistency is hard. Otherwise, though, I think this guy turned out fantastic, and it's an example of you can do great work with a wet palette. And then we've got the well palette. I don't have Mr. Ogre done here, but he's a little bit tighter. His highlights go up a little bit more. We've got a little bit more tight detail on him because I can do it. Got a little bit more of more refined textures on him. See the fine brushstrokes on the belt here? That's something that the well palette makes easier because I can thin down these light paints and I can use them to get these little details painted on. So all that, and then see the little texture here on this leather and that. So I find that when I'm doing really lighter colors and I'm trying to get really fine stuff. That said, other painters do this with a wet palette, so your mileage may vary. It's all your own experience. And then I've got a bunch of other ones that I've painted with the well palette. This is kind of my pro tips art style, for lack of a better word. These are all minis I painted on the stream for Reaper, so you can kind of see the results that I can get with a well palette. There we go. I'm going to conclude this stream. Wow, it was a long one. Long video for you today. But I hope you found it useful. I hope this is information that will help you to make decisions, and hopefully it'll inspire you to try both kinds of palettes. Because like I said, it really is you can do anything with any of them. It's just a little easier or a little harder to do some techniques with each one. So this has been Anne. This is Painting Big. You can find me other places. I have paintingbig.net on the web for my website. I've got a gallery of work up there, as well as all my socials, and a link and examples for my Patreon, which is patreon.com/paintingbig. Come on over, give me a look. I've got some free stuff up there. Obviously, I've got a bunch of free stuff here on the YouTube as well. Thank you, everybody, for supporting me in all this. And hey, happy painting. This is Anne signing off.